The Soundcheck podcast is coming up. Please continue to hold. Keep up with the Soundcheck podcast and everything that's happening in the New Sounds empire. Just go to newsounds.org and follow us on social media. All of the icons are in the top right corner of the page. All of our other musicians are currently playing for other customers. Please stay with us, and someone will play for you in just a moment.
Lonely, average height, brown eyes slightly disproportionate, curly hair, Jufro, 20 years old, 20 years old. Slightly hunched, occasionally employed, anthropologist, chain-smoking Jew, currently
From newsounds.org, this is another episode of the Soundcheck Podcast, our live in-studio series of performances streaming on Facebook and YouTube. I'm John Schaefer. Back in 2006, the singer, songwriter, and pianist Gabriel Kahane released his Craigslist Leader, a set of art songs built around actual posts from Craigslist. Some of them were hilarious, some of them were surprisingly poignant, all of them were deeply weird, but the songs themselves were beautifully crafted, and in the years since, Gabriel Kahane has written a number of collections of art songs built around certain themes, the most recent of which is his new album called Book of Travelers, a portrait of a divided America in 10 songs and the result of almost 9,000 miles of rail travel through the country. It brings Gabriel Kahane back to our New York studio to play some of those songs for us. This first one is called November.
When last we spoke, I sang of end times, of cities washed away, the bloodless halls, a flooded station, and that last train from LA. Well, 3 years have passed and here I am in the waiting room, delayed with all the restless. Some 60 eyes fixed hard and fast on the TV playing something senseless. Me, I dream of a broken watch with hands like vines. In the dream I see the sweep of centuries. I am a prehistoric bird, and I wandered 6 lane. It would be generous to call them boulevards with their dead-eyed metal herd. And I've come to peg the faces, all of the faces off of every clock, then set myself to ponder the golden shoals, the clouds, the rotting dock. Can you hear the carnival rising, the brutal fairgrounds of glow, sunburned families laughing at the toy gun game stall, someone screaming below. I want to tell you about November, the people that I met, and sleeping badly on Pullman pallets, blue blanket caked in sweat. Cardiogram power lines, heart of the Department of the Interior, glow in the dark Casio, breathing fast. When last we spoke, I sang of end times, of cities washed away, the bloodless halls, a flooded station. Could a train be an escape?
That is Gabriel Kahane, live here in our Soundcheck studio, and a song called November. It is the opening track on his new album called Book of Travelers. And Gabriel, it's rare for an album to begin sort of in medias res, as they say, in the middle of things. When last we spoke, I mean, it's almost as if this album is kind of following on a series of kind of like-minded portraits of our country. If that's not too highfalutin a way to kind of retrospectively look at your work.
No, not at all. I mean, it's great to be back, John. I feel like you've known me since I was a child. I first came here in maybe 2006.
Probably, yeah.
That Craigslist Theater first was birthed. No, I think you're absolutely onto something. That opening lyric is in a way a reference to the end of my previous album, The Ambassador, which ends with a song called Union Station, which imagines this kind of post-Diluvian apocalypse, and it sort of brings us to Union Station after a flood, and I leave on the last train, and it's this sort of imaginary apocalypse, and then we begin. 3 years have passed, and here I am in the waiting room, delayed with all the restless. So I guess I was trying to pull along those who'd been listening to that record into this one.
Mm-hmm. Now, The Ambassador was an LA-centric thing.
Yes.
All of the tracks were named after addresses of buildings in Los Angeles.
Exactly.
But November is also very specific. It's not just any November. This is November 2016. Tell us a little bit about the backstory of how Book of Travelers came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had been commissioned by the Brooklyn Academy of Music to make a follow-up piece to The Ambassador, which was staged there as part of the Next Wave Festival in 2014. And I spent a lot of 2015 and 2016 on tour opening for my friends Punch Brothers. And it was really my first time having that sort of typically debut experience. And so, I think we associate usually the sophomore album is the one that's travel centric, because that's, you've been doing the hotel thing, so on and so forth. For me, I've sort of been developmentally delayed, and now it's my fourth album that is preoccupied with travel. So anyway, going back to the summer of 2016, I was working on a collection of songs dealing with travel, but in a kind of more cerebral way. I was interested in linking my own experiences of travel to the history of travel, looking at the evolution of travel from generally a religious experience in the form of pilgrimages, and then to a mode of edification in the 18th century with the grand tour for people of means. And then in the 19th century, travel became a mode of leisure when the factory owners realized that their employees would be more productive if they gave them some time off. And then in this country, I think it loops back to the spiritual in the 20th century with the national park system, and the way that the national park system was written about has this kind of sort of the sublime in nature, looking for God in the trees. And this was all well and good, but I felt like I needed to, kind of personalize it. And I had written, I think, 17 or 18 songs. And I thought, well, I need some framework. And there's a German writer, W.G. Sebald, who's written a collection of books. He died about 10 years ago, but huge inspiration of mine, and wrote these kind of very, very wide-ranging travelogues that were hugely digressive, but always kind of anchored by travel. One in particular, Rings of Saturn, it's a walking tour of the English countryside, but in it he writes about everything from Renaissance painting to the silk trade to Nazi death camps, and yet it feels wholly of a piece. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go on a trip of my own as a way of framing what I've written. And I decided, given the sort of convulsions in the country, that I would go on a trip the morning after the presidential election, regardless of the outcome. Now, of course, the election happened the way it happened, and I ended up throwing away about 85% of the music I'd written and starting more or less from scratch. I think there are 2 songs that predate the trip. But that's basically what happened. I left my phone at home, got on the train, shocked as so many of us were. I was really interested in trying to get outside of the digital bubble in which I think many of us live, and just to talk to people face to face and experience the country. And that's sort of how this came to be.
So you logged something like 8,980 miles. Was that the figure?
That's an exact number.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well memorized.
Well, I think for a moment there, it was part of the title of the piece, wasn't it?
Yes. The stage piece, I can't tell if it's confusing or helpful, sort of differentiates itself from me just playing in clubs by the addition of 8980 : Book of Travelers.
Book of Travelers,
Yeah.
right. So over the course of those almost 9,000 miles, you're riding the rails across the country, and what? Talking to strangers on a train? I mean, that sounds like a Hitchcock film. But, you would just like strike up conversations and notate what people had told you?
Yeah, well, there's this extraordinary thing with American train travel, which is so slow. Its inefficiency, I think, is also perhaps its greatest asset in a way. And there's this quality of openness, which I think maybe has to do with the way that assignments in the dining car occur, which is basically at random. If you're a party of one, you make a reservation to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you're seated at the next available spot. And so as a result of that, I was having conversations of an hour or more 3 times a day with 2 to 3 people. So, talking to 6 to 9 people just at mealtime alone, on top of whatever other conversations I was having. And I found that the train, for whatever reason, acts as this kind of social lubricant. And I think maybe some of that had to do also with the moment that we were in, this very tender moment that we were in as a country, where everyone on all sides of the political spectrum seemed to be really eager to talk about what was happening, to talk about their lives.
So did you tell people what you were up to, or did you just kind of, wait till you heard something good and then write it down and figure out what to do with it later?
I wrote down, I didn't record anyone, of course, but I tried to write down everything I could remember. I kept about a 70,000 word diary over the course of those 13 days. And it wasn't until months later, I was really kind of paralyzed after the trip in terms of the responsibility of telling really intimate stories that people were sharing. And so it really wasn't until May of 2017 that I finally started writing songs about the people I'd met, because I felt so, again, paralyzed by, the sense of ethics around it. And I did tell people, I said, I tried to put it in as humble terms as possible. I said, I'm a musician. I was trying to get out of my bubble. I feel like I do believe that a certain amount of the division in this country is manufactured by people who profit from that division, which is not to say that there aren't grievous differences and grievous iniquities and injustices that in a weird way I'm in sort of tacitly arguing for us to listen to each other and be more empathetic. I see that as a road to racial justice and economic justice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talking to people, that's the best way, as you no doubt found, to get to know people who are different from you, and maybe did you find that maybe the differences were outweighed by the things you had in common?
I mean, yes and no. I think generally I was deeply moved by people's relationships to their families.
Yeah.
And inadvertently, this album is about family. Almost all of the songs, with the exception really of the opening track. I think every other song, and maybe the fourth song, which is weirdly about a German travel guidebook. I think all the other songs are about family, either about my family or about the families of the people I encountered. And, I did find that what was really different was tone. I had disagreements with people. I tried not to argue with people. But I find that when you're faced with someone whose beliefs, even when you believe that their political outlook is toxic and dangerous and damaging, there's something about seeing a human face attached to it as opposed to just words on a screen that's really transformative in how you're able to deal with those differences.
Well, and that is one of the most toxic things about, online forums and comments and chat rooms and stuff, is you don't have that. And
close this window.
So this next song you're going to do for us, called Baltimore, it is a story, and it has a very simple, yet to me very striking line in the middle of it. The line, "Why am I telling you this?" Did this guy, Jason, actually say that to you, or did somebody say that to you while you were talking?
No, I think I'm always a little cagey about talking too specifically about lyrics, because I think that one of the great gifts that artists can offer to a listener or a viewer is the ability to kind of fill in the negative space with their own experience. But of course, this is a really specific project where I've kind of made it explicit that these songs are about people I encountered. But inevitably, there's always a little bit of fiction in service of truth. And I said a few days ago, I was saying to someone, I feel like the things that I've invented in this record are much less shocking and provocative than the things that are true. And that's sometimes the way it is, I think, with any kind of narrative form, that the things that you have to sort of invent for, narrative efficiency or whatever are not so so unusual. But I guess as to the question of that particular line, I think I was maybe more interested in the idea of what it's like to have stream of consciousness in a lyric. And that's something that I sort of explore in a couple songs on this record. And some of that comes through the influence of my friend, the poet Matthew Zapruder, who I think does the most beautiful job of really introducing kind of unadulterated train of thought into poetry and making it really sing.
Yeah, and you've set some of his poetry to music in the past.
Yeah.
But here, setting the words of fellow American travelers at a turbulent time in our history in November of 2016. You want to play the song for us?
This is Baltimore.
I got the news on the satellite phone. Jason, come home. Jason, dear. I heard it on the forest floor. 6 years of backcountry trails to the lake. Machete and snake. Machete I learned to cradle in the old state park. Roosevelt 33, he had a plan for every young man. Give him an axe and a seed, give him a pack and a tree. Teach him to care for himself, give him fresh air for his health. Send money back to family, back to Baltimore. The tall boy convenience store, the indifferent, the endless war. And I know what that is, and I know what that is, and I don't need it anymore, but I have to go home. Luke was the son of some well-to-do folk. My family was broke, but we became friends. The parking lot, the chewed-up field. I started in the park just as he was going in. a hard 8 to 10 for selling to kids. My mama worked the county jail. Roosevelt's tree army under the sun, the work would be done while America bled by the greed of the rich. The boys planted trees and found God in the pitch. They stared at the sod in each fist. Why am I telling you this? Is it that I'm nervous to be going back to Baltimore? The tall boy convenience store, the indifferent, the endless war. And I know what that is, and I know what that is, and I don't need it anymore, but I have to go home. Luke, I guess, got himself into a fight, took him to the infirmary later that night. Nothing serious, sure, but next morning he died. Then the satellite phone with the crew, which meant I didn't cry. I'm taking the train to take time for my thoughts, pregnant with loss, preparing for all the things that maybe make you feel. I pay my respects and then I'll take a walk the neighborhood block, and then I will leave.
Once again, Gabriel Kahane, live here in the New Sound Studio on this edition of the Soundcheck Podcast. The song is Baltimore. The album, his latest, is called Book of Travelers. And there is you did a stage version of this, as you mentioned before, under the name 8980 Book of Travelers. Now you'll be touring around, you and the piano, including Murmur here in Brooklyn on September 20th. But the album is more than just you and piano, right? There's something, there's this thing with the practice mutes involved. What is that?
Yeah, so this record went through an interesting transformation. As I mentioned before, I had written these 17 or 18 songs, and I sent some of them to my friend Blake Mills, the wonderful guitarist and producer, maybe known best for his work on the Alabama Shakes record, Sound and Color, but just an extraordinary musician in his own right, beautiful singer and guitarist. And we were going to work on the record with his mentor and colleague Tony Berg, who ultimately ended up co-producing the record with me. And he was the one who sort of said, I think you're not quite done with this record. I think you need to, dig into your trip more, write some more songs. And then we spent a week in February just working on three of these tunes. And I sort of let him have the keys to the kingdom and arrange, produce. He played guitar, bass, drums, synths, and so on and so forth. And he can be really strong-willed, but at the end of the day, he's ruthless with his own work. And at the end of this week, he said, I feel like I've made your songs not sound like you. And we did one song that was just solo piano and voice, one that actually didn't make the record, and then two productions which did make the record. But his advice was to kind of reverse engineer the arrangements we'd made back to piano. And that sort of coincided with my having done a solo tour where I was singing Schumann from the piano and revisiting Craigslist Leader and having rearranged really big songs from the Ambassador, like Empire Liquor Mart, with 30 musicians back to a solo piano arrangement. And it felt like, for me, it was a return to my roots. In the intervening years, I started playing guitar and doing some looping. But there was something about this trip and the intimacy and the vulnerability around it that really lent itself to just piano and voice. But then there was this question of, well, how do you make a record that's just piano and voice in 2018 not sound regressive? And I worked with an amazing engineer, Joseph Lorge, who works a lot with Tony Berg and with Blake Mills, and really invited him to use the piano sounds that we were getting as a canvas. So we did a lot of work on a Yamaha U3 with the practice mute. It's an upright piano with this felt mute that creates this very, very sort of warm, soft sound. But then also just kind of gave him permission to put all kinds of effects on the piano. So it is actually the album is just performances of me sitting at the piano. Some of them are, edited together, but there are no overdubs on the record. It's just, I think, some brilliant engineering by Joseph that makes the record feel a little bit more than piano and voice.
Yeah. And the effect of the practice mute is, I guess it's kind of similar to for classical music fans, a harpsichord versus a clavichord, where the harpsichord isn't a particularly loud instrument, but it's.
I honestly don't even know what a clavichord sounds like.
It sounds like almost like a lute. It's just a very quiet.
Got it.
It's the parlor version of the harpsichord.
It's almost like if you imagine if you put a towel in the piano, what it would sound like. And of course, it's felt between the hammer and the string, and that's what gives it that quality of sound.
And you said you said back to your roots. I mean, when many people say, I'm going back to my roots, they're going back to whatever pop music they grew up with. You grew up with classical music, right?
That's both true, and it's yes and. I mean, I grew up in a house with a concert pianist and conductor for a father, but again, my mom and dad played in folk rock bands together in high school. There are some incriminating photographs. Interestingly, one of their bandmates in a band called The American Revelation was the great reed player Doug Wieselman.
Really?
Whom I'm sure has been on this show a number of times. But yeah, they were all very, very close friends, all short Jewish people. I guess they bonded in that way. But growing up, there was a lot of Paul Simon, a lot of Joni Mitchell, a lot of the Beatles. And, despite the fact that Craigslist Leader was the thing that sort of popped me onto certain people's radars, I came to writing concert music after writing songs, and really writing, songs that live in kind of functional harmony, and sort of realizing more and more that even though the piano is not really associated with folk music, I feel like I'm a folk musician from an emotional standpoint, and as a storyteller, I feel like my values as a songwriter are most in tune with the values of folk music.
Well, we've talked a lot so far about the lyrical content of these songs, but the musical content, I mean, Baltimore, it's got this kind of chromatic bell tolling thing happening, which, the song has a very simple, folky aspect in the kind of the left-hand harmony that is then curiously colored by, I mean, to me, that's a composer at work. That's someone who has heard Bartók or Messiaen or people like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I guess if you made a lead sheet of the song, the chords get a little bit out there, but not more out there than you'd have like in a Radiohead song. I think probably the thing that's unusual about it is actually the registration. It's the wide, it's the way that these chords are voiced in a super wide, but it's just right. Yeah, but it doesn't register that way.
Right. It doesn't feel, and that kind of taking something that is conventional and making it sound unconventional, I mean, that's,
yeah.
I love when that happens.
Yeah,
I love when people
I think that's definitely, part of my project is to try to remain rooted in some tradition, but also kind of push at the walls of it. And I think also, using voice leading to push harmony into funnier places than maybe you expect it to go in songwriting, but having the vocal line continue to be very, very sort of linear and I guess tuneful in a way.
Yeah. Interesting that you invoke Radiohead, who obviously have done a lot of that, but it also makes me think of some of Brian Eno's early songs where you listen and you think, wow, and then you go to the guitar or the piano to figure it out. It's like, oh man, it's C, F, and G. How did he do that?
Yeah. Well, I think that's also, I think we're in this really interesting moment in music where all of the kind of orthodoxy around what is acceptable and what is not acceptable has really encouraged a generation of composers to re-engage with tonality in deeply surprising ways. I think of, my friend Timo Andrus, who, as he's gotten older, he's older. He's, what 32, is he like? 33. But in his music, you hear harmony, but he's just got this kind of kaleidoscopic way of expressing it. Same thing with Andrew Norman, where you can sit down and sort of reduce it to things that feel somewhat functional, but the way that they're expressed either through color or registration is so unusual.
Well, now you're referring to a bunch of composers who, like yourself, grew up completely conversant, in both vernacular / popular music and so-called classical music, and where, to the point where those distinctions almost begin to, and really, I think yours is the first generation where you kind of had to put those walls in place, because for you guys, it was all what you grew up with.
Right. Yeah, or to put it another way, we weren't burdened by the walls existing.
Yeah.
And it's really lovely to hear you say that, because I think many of my colleagues and I have been sort of bristling against the preoccupation with categorization as opposed to just dealing with quality and dealing with craft, because that's really, at the end of the day, I have some dear old friends who are incredible.
Define old.
87 and 84. Is that
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. These are wonderful patrons of the new music world. They commission a lot of music, and I adopted from them a basically binary system of judging art, which is GB or NGB, which means goosebumps or no goosebumps. And that's basically what it comes down to for me is, do you feel something or not? And I think when we get wrapped up in categorization, we lose that fundamental question, which is, does it move us or not?
Yeah. Well, the stories in Book of Travelers, I mean, they're both literally moving. You're on a train crossing the country, but they're also, you kind of feel for the guy in Baltimore, for example. It's like the dark side of tie a yellow ribbon round the old oak tree. This guy is going home, and he's really kind of torn up about it.
Yeah.
And, as you were just saying, sometimes the most interesting thing you can do with conventional material is make it sound new and unusual. And to take these stories and to make something different that is also true to the original stories seems like you. I think I've just lost a piece of my microphone.
I think the microphone was very moved by what you were just saying.
But so again, you're walking a line in telling these tales. What is the story behind this next song that you're going to play for us?
I think because the initial reaction on the internet has been so varied. And it's been interesting. I'm going to confess that I've been reading some reviews, and the kind of Rorschach test of how people situate themselves or project onto the song is so fascinating. There's a song that deals sort of implicitly with the opioid crisis, and one review made the narrator a woman, a mother, and one narrator made the narrator a father. And I just think that's so interesting. And again, referring back to what I was saying about negative space, I'm such a believer in letting people fill in the gaps. And that's also been the case for the song that I'm going to close with. So if I can be evasive.
You just were.
Shall I sing it?
Yes, you shall. This is Gabriel Kahane with Little Love.
A long gray silence had ambled down the coast. You drew in sand all the things we'd missed the most. Little love, little love. Little love, little love. Little love, little love. I hope we die here when we're old. Case the shore to record this holy place. White cliffs and starfish, the tide like ruined lace. Little love, little love. Little love, little love. Little love, little love. I hope we die here when we're old. flowers by the sea. All shrunken hands, twisted spines, and halting speech. We'll listen for the long gray silence to gather and increase. When it does, we'll close our eyes and rest in narrow peace. Little love, little love. Little love, little love. Little love, little love. I hope we die here when we're old. Little love, little love. I hope we die here when we're old.
Gabriel Kahane with Little Love. It's a song from the new album called Book of Travelers, the latest from Gabriel Kahane. Well, it's the latest creative project of yours that's been released, but you always have many things going. Musical theater, concert works, your own solo pieces, The Little Matter of Vera, who is now got to be close to 2 months old.
It's true. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Now, you mentioned before that family is a big theme in this, but of course, while you were writing this, it would have been pre-fatherhood. But has it kind of changed your whole perspective?
Well, we've talked about the fact that that this album is Vera's younger brother, having been born almost 2 months to the day, or having been released almost 2 months to the day after she was born in June. I think it's deepened my belief that we are, in theory, forced separation notwithstanding, and those who have stood by and watched as that's occurred. But in theory, we are united by devotion to family and loyalty to family. And I do feel that sense in myself has only grown stronger. I think, as a father, that there are things that you just can't appreciate about what it is to be responsible for a child until
you have to do it.
Have one. Yeah. And so I think that a lot of the awe that I felt on that trip for the kinds of sacrifices that people I met were making for their families, I guess in some sense, and I'm just thinking about this for the first time now, retroactively makes even more sense to me.
Yeah. Because, I mean, hearing some of these songs, you released a couple of them yourself last year online, but hearing them now again and knowing that this had happened, it's hard not to hear, for me as an outsider, not to hear them a little differently, because family is so important. And
well, I think my wife was pregnant with Vera when I was on the trip. Is that? No, I'm sorry.
No,
she was not. No, that's fully a year before. But we were starting to think about having kids. So I guess it was somehow in the air. And the other thing I would say, increasingly I realized, people often talk about the fact that my father is a musician and so not far from the tree, but my mother is a psychologist, and more the work that I do, I think, is so rooted in things that I've picked up from her having to do with empathy and listening. She's in private practice and she's one of the great listeners I know, and that's, it's her trade. And so I think with a project like this, I feel like it's very much the product of both sides of my parentage. And I think that interest in family and in getting strangers to talk, separate from the fact that I now have a family of my own, I think maybe has something to do with my mother.
Well, getting strangers to talk is a wonderful, I mean, I do that all the time here. And, anybody who does interviews as a matter of course, journalists, broadcasters, whatever, you just never know what you're going to get, as what's the movie, the Tom Hanks movie, Life? You never know what you're going to get. Life's like a box of chocolate. What the heck? Forrest Gump. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it just, sometimes you end up with something completely off the wall that is totally unexpected.
Absolutely. I mean, so many of the experiences that I had on this trip were so deeply surprising and sometimes confounding, and really kind of wrestled me out of assumptions that I had about the way that our country really looks. And I think that it's so valuable to be able to step outside of your life and your assumptions and see what people are really like.
All right. So what's your takeaway from this project? Did you come away from this trip optimistic, pessimistic?
I think both. I think I feel an incredible terror about the fact that the White House is populated by white nationalists, and there's no other way to say it than that.
There are other ways to say it.
there are other ways to say it, but I mean, I think I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but I think that's what we're faced with at this point, based on the policies being put forward, and it is destroying the lives of millions of people in this country. And so I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish at all, because I feel deeply distraught, particularly as the grandson of an immigrant who fled Nazi Germany. I think that we're in a deeply, deeply tenuous situation. That being said, I think it's also the case that if we can turn off our devices, and if we can be cognizant of the fact that there are various mechanisms in place that want to amplify difference for purposes of power and profit, that we can discover that we have more in common than that divides us, and that part of that divide has to do with our mutual contempt for each other. And that I think if we can set aside that contempt without setting aside the intensity with which we feel our differences, but to set aside contempt, I do feel the possibility of hope for this country.
Well, and you've mentioned twice now unplugging from your devices. So you didn't take your iPhone with you on this train trip. So where did this cover image come from?
So the morning that I left Penn Station, I stopped at Best Buy and I bought a $120 digital camera. And I had actually selected another image, which is on the back, which I thought was going to be the cover. And then I was on the subway going to meet with the designer, and I was flipping through old photos, and I looked at that one, and I thought, that I accidentally took a nice photo. I think that should be on the cover. It's in the Columbia River Gorge. It's at the end of the Empire Builder from Chicago to Portland, Oregon.
The album is called Book of Travelers, and it will see Gabriel Kahane traveling around the country, including coming back to New York on September 20th to play at Murmur in Brooklyn. Gabe, it's always great to have you here. It's a terrific story and a terrific record. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure.
This is Soundcheck.